Hello and welcome to the Soviet School of Chess, the next lesson. We are still on general tactics and strategy, and in the first part of this lesson we'll talk about restriction of mobility by cutting the squares off. And by that I mean the fact that the mobility of a piece is restricted when the squares to which it could move are under attack by opponent's pieces. So let me show you some concrete examples. Okay, so this is an ancient puzzle. And in order to solve this, to find the best move for white, first we need to see which pieces are restricted. So if you can see, first of all pawns are restricted because they just cannot move. This king is restricted by the opponent's pieces, by white pieces. So by the knight and the king. So you can see the king is restricted and king cannot move. Okay, so what about this bishop on b1? Well, you can see that this bishop on b1 has only one legal move, and this is a bishop to a2. But this move is played, then either knight to c2 just delivers checkmate to the king. So you can also see that the bishop b1 is also restricted. Black cannot move the bishop without being checkmated. So the only piece black can move in this position is this bishop on h6. And now I told you that it's white's turn, so once you notice this, you can see that there is also a way for white to restrict the mobility of this bishop. And how is this done? By cutting the squares off. So you can see that the bishop can go to these squares, and if you just play knight to e6, now the knight is completely dominating this bishop. The bishop cannot move without being captured by the knight. So now, well, the best move for black is just to move the bishop anywhere, and once the bishop is moved, white will capture the bishop. Now the only legal move is this bishop to a2, and now knight just delivers checkmate. So this puzzle is actually mate in 3. So we can go back, and now this move, knight to e6, you see that this knight now dominates the bishop. And this is actually rarely seen in the practice, that it is knight who dominates the bishop and not vice versa. And this is only possible because of this pawn here on e3, which obstructs the movement of the bishop. So thanks to this pawn, the bishop has only this square to go to, and this is how knight can restrict the mobility of bishop by cutting the squares off. A much more common scenario is like this. So you can see that this is very common pattern. So if the bishop is across the knight and there are two squares between them, that means that bishop is dominating the knight, because all the squares knight can go to are controlled by the bishop. So you don't need extra pawn or some extra piece. If the knight is on the edge of the board, the bishop can very easily control it. Also, this bishop is controlling this knight, so this knight has only two squares, and it's very easy dominated by this bishop. So this is very common pattern, and it's worthwhile to remember it, since it can be applied in many different positions. Okay, let's now see the next position, one from the real game. So this is game between Keres and Kotov. And now it's white's turn to move. So before we decide on the move, before we find the winning move, we have to notice that this queen here is pretty restricted by white's pieces. So if you look the squares of the queen, where can queen go? Well, here, no, 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 no. So the only two squares the queen can be is the square she's currently at, and this square d7. So if you can find way to attack queen, and to attack the queen and simultaneously control d7, then the queen will be captured. And in this position this move exists, but it requires a little bit more calculation. You have to look two moves deep for this. So how to attack both of these squares? Well, simply by playing knight to e5. But for this to work, you have to have the situation in which, well, black here cannot take the knight, because if black takes the knight, then there is a checkmate here. So this pawn is pinned, by this checkmate threat here. And now in this position, black just resigned the game, because you can see that this queen cannot go anywhere. it's completely trapped. So again, the movement of the queen is restricted by white pieces cutting the squares off. Okay, let's now go to the second part of the lesson and talk about restriction on mobility by having the piece of the edge of the board. So if the piece is on the edge of the board, its mobility, it's restricted by the very nature of chess rules. And it is also for this reason that you want to keep your pieces in the center, so you want to keep them centralized, as close to center as possible, because when the pieces are on the edge, then their mobility is quite decreased. So let's see some examples of this principle, how it works in practice. So in this position, it's white to move, and you can see that the knight is in the edge of the board. And being it on the edge of the board, this knight is a very, very weak piece, and you will see that it's so weak that it can be captured practically just by white's king. So you can imagine if this knight, for example, was somewhere here on e6, it would be a very strong piece, and black would even be possibly better in this position. He could hope for a win. But you know, in this position, white has a very simple sequence of moves to capture the knight. So it begins with knight to g3, attacking the knight. Knight has to move away. He can go on to f1 to save his life. Now king to f2, again attacking the knight. So now if knight you know, comes back to h2, then king to g2, and the knight is trapped. He's gone. So the knight here tried to escape via d2. But now, if you remember how bishop can dominate the knight, it has to come across the knight with the two squares between them. So bishop to a2, you see these two squares are in between. So this bishop now completely dominates the knight. Although there is only this b1 square which needs to be covered, but also the bishop covers these squares. So the knight is completely dominated by the bishop, but most importantly, this b2 square is controlled. And now black knight, you know, has no squares to escape. Wherever black knight goes, it will be captured. So black cannot avoid following king to e2 and just capturing the knight. So for example, if black plays something like king to d6, then just king to e2, now capturing the knight, because like I said, all the squares in which knight can escape are now controlled by the white pieces. So you can say again that in this position, knight's mobility is restricted by cutting the squares off, but also this all came about because a knight was on the edge of the board. Let's now look another example. This is also from the real game. So in this position, it's white to move, and it's actually mate in 3. So I encourage you to pause the video and try to find mate in 3 yourself. It's very interesting mate. Okay, so the sequence begins with first noticing that king is in the edge of the board, so this is important. This is what we are talking about. So king's mobility is restricted by king being in the edge of the board. And you can also notice that in many mating patterns, if you want to mate the king, in the endgame you need to have the king on the edge of the board. So for example, if you are mating with 2 rooks, or a rook and king, or against king, or queen and king against king, or even if you mate with 2 bishops, or with knight and the bishop in the endgame, in all these endgames, king has to be on the edge of the board for the checkmate to work. So here you can notice that king is on the edge of the board, so his mobility is restricted by being on the edge, but also his mobility is restricted by white's pieces, so king cannot move anywhere. So if you notice this, you can calculate the sequence of move. It begins with rook to f8 check. The only way to get out of the check is to capture the rook with the queen, and now you can sacrifice another rook, so rook to f8 check. Again, the only way to escape the check is to capture the rook, and now queen takes g6 checkmate. So this very famous and very beautiful mating pattern is called a Paulette mate, and you can see this in I think there are several games of Paul Morphy in which he used this pattern or variation of this pattern to deliver a checkmate. And this is it for this lesson. So we talked about restriction of mobility by cutting squares off, and also by the piece being on the edge of the board. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you very soon in the next episode. Cheers!